Yes, Prof. We are now live on FB and YouTube. Yeah?
Okay, good.
I think we can start now, Prof. Can we?
Yes, please.
Okay, all right.
Prof. Nazari, boleh kita start?
Boleh? All right. Professor John L. Esposito, Professor of Religion and International Affairs and of Islamic Studies, Georgetown University. Professor Datuk Seri Daeng Muhammad Nasir Daeng Ibrahim, President of Academy of Professors Malaysia. Professor Muhammad Nazrul Ismail, Chairman of BDS Malaysia and member of Academy of Professors Malaysia. Professor Datuk Muhammad Abu Bakar from Institute of for Islamic Civilization, Inspire, University Sultan Zainal Abidin. Professor Ahmad Fauzi Abdul Hamid from Political Science Section, School of Distance Education, University Science Malaysia. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum and good morning. My name is Raharul. I'm a research officer at the Academy of Professors Malaysia, MC for today's APM public lecture series. It is with pleasure I welcome all of you to this public lecture entitled Islam, the Muslim World and West, Navigating the Way Forward, organized by Academy of Professors Malaysia. All right. For your information, Academy of Professors Malaysia, or APM, is an NGO that functions as a think tank that combines expertise and mobilizes strategic thinking of professors to develop society. APM is an association which is academic-driven, inclusive, free from political interference, equipped with high integrity, authoritative, professional, and practicing genuine academic freedom. At the moment, APM has 350 members, comprising 34 fellows, 227 ordinary members, and 89 associate members. Yeah? Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to invite Professor Datuk Seri Daeng Muhammad Nasir Daeng Ibrahim to give his opening remarks. Please welcome, Datuk Seri.
Are you ready for me to speak, or is somebody else speaking?
No, the president will speak first and introduce you to the audience.
Oh, I didn't hear anything. That's why I was asking. Okay.
Yes.
The president's internet connection is not so good again. That's the reason why it's quiet. I hope he can come back because I think he got disconnected just now.
All right. Yeah.
Okay. Then you need to unmute, Professor Dato. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I've done it.
We can't hear you, Dato Rai. Can't hear you. We can't see or hear you. You have actually disappeared from the screen. Chana Zaru, how are you going to proceed?
Okay.
Okay, then, yeah. All right, please. Hey.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Zarul. Thank you, Dr. Zarul. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Professor John L. Esposito, Professor of Religion and International Affairs and of Islamic Studies, Georgetown University, our guest speaker. Professor Muhammad Nazir Ismail, Chairman of BDS Malaysia and APM member, our moderator for today's public lecture. Professor Datuk Muhammad Abu Bakar, Institute for Islamic Civilization, or Inspire, UNIZA, our discussant. Professor Ahmad Fauzi Abdul Hamid, Political Science Section, School of Distance Education, USM, our discussant today. APM members and participants of today's public lecture. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good morning. First and foremost, please allow me to welcome all of you to Academy of Professors Malaysia APM public lecture series. And this APM public lecture series, held for its second time, is one of the flagship programs organized by APM, apart from several other major programs such as the APM Honorary Fellow Lecture Series, APM Discourse, and APM Roundtable Discussion. This program is organized to honor and in recognition of prominent and leading scholars, outside the circle of APM organization, from within or outside the country. These leading scholars are selected based on their substantial contribution in their respective fields of knowledge and in terms of policy and public advocacies, as well as recognition received either locally or abroad. This public lecture also aims to provide a platform for scholars to discuss strategic issues that will not only benefit policymakers, but also community as a whole. For your information, the first APM public lecture was delivered by Professor Dato' Asma Ismail, President of Academy of Science Malaysia. And today, APM feels honored and privileged that the second APM public lecture will be delivered by Professor John E. Esposito, a leading scholar in the field of religion and international affairs and of Islamic studies. The title of the lecture is Islam, the Muslim World and the West, Navigating the Way Forward. Before that, before we invite Prof. Esposito, please allow me to share with you a brief biodata of Professor Esposito. Professor John L. Esposito is Professor of Religion and International Affairs and of Islamic Studies and founding director of the Prince Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding and the Bridge Initiative, Protecting Pluralism, Ending Islamophobia at Georgetown University. In 2019, he was as Rajaratnam Professor of Strategic Studies, Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Singapore. His more than 55 books include What Everyone Needs to Know About Islam, Sharia, What Everyone Needs to Know, The Future of Islam, Who Speaks for Islam, What a Billion Muslims Really Think, Religion and Violence, Unholy War, Terror in the Name of Islam, The Islamic Threat, Myth or Reality, Islam and Democracy After the Arab Spring, Islamophobia, and the Challenge of Pluralism in the 21st Century. Prof. Esposito's writing are translated into more than 45 languages. Prof. Esposito is past president of the American Academy of Religion and Middle East Studies Association of North America. He has been a member of the World Economic Forum Council of 100 years and the EC European Network of Experts on De-Radicalization, a senior scientist for the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies and ambassador for the UN Alliance of Civilization. He has served as consultant to the US Department of State and other agencies, European and Asian government, corporations, universities, and media worldwide. Finally, I hope and I'm sure you'll benefit from Professor Esposito's lecture and the commentaries from Professor Dato' Muhammad Abu Bakar and Professor Ahmad Fauzi. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I now hand over the floor back to the MC. Thank you.
Thank you, Dato' Sri. Now I would like to invite Professor Muhammad Nazri Ismail to moderate the webinar. Please welcome.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much, Mr. MC. In an article published by The Atlantic in 2016, Robert Kaplan wrote that the relationship between Islam and the West began in the 7th and 8th centuries, when Islam extinguished Christianity in North Africa. North Africa at the time was interestingly considered part of Europe. The Roman Empire then broke up, and the Germanic people shaped the elements that came to form what is now called Western civilization. According to Kaplan, after a few more centuries, the modern European states began to develop, evolving from feudalism to early modern empires and over time to nationalism and democracy. Kaplan thus concluded that the West emerged in Northern Europe mainly after Islam had divided the Mediterranean world. The relationship between Europe and Islam continued, often violent in nature, as we saw during the Crusades and later during the European colonization of Muslim lands. We fast forward to the 21st century to see the last settler colonial project of the West, which is ongoing in Palestine now. supported by European powers and the United States of America. However, by this time, the Muslim world is no longer monolithic. For example, we are now witnessing that even though some Muslim countries, such as Malaysia, Pakistan, and Indonesia, refuse to recognize Israel, some other Muslim countries, or perhaps rulers of Muslim countries, are supporting the project. They include the UAE, Oman, Bahrain, Egypt, and Sudan. Moreover, these rulers seem to enjoy close relationship with the West. But interestingly, even though Western governments are still supporting Israel, nevertheless, the most vocal voices, especially from among civil societies, which are opposed to the colonial project in Palestine, also seem to come from the West, including from the United States. And this is giving hope to some that maybe one day the Western governments are the ones that will eventually help to liberate Palestine. Moreover, the loudest criticism towards the abuse of the human rights of citizens in Muslim countries, such as in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and also Egypt, also seem to come from the West, including from the United States. And on top of that, according to some reports, Islam is also the fastest growing religion in the West. In other words, the picture as far as the relationship between Islam, the Muslim world, and the West is actually quite complicated and not so straightforward. We are therefore very lucky to have with us today Professor Esposito, who we hope will help us all understand what is happening now and what may happen in the future. Professor Esposito will speak for about an hour. After that, we will listen to our invited discussants, Professor Datuk Muhammad Abu Bakar, and Professor Ahmad Fauzi Abdul Hamid. I will introduce them, both of them, to you later. Now, without further ado, I invite Professor Esposito to deliver his speech. Professor Esposito, the floor is yours. Please.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I appreciate your introduction. It makes what I have to say and what I want to do a little easier. The conventional wisdom for many years in the US and Europe has been that although Western governments espouse the promotion of democracy and human rights, that in fact, too often they've practiced democratic exceptionalism, promoting democracy in many other parts of the world, but not in the Muslim world. The Bush administration in its second term acknowledged that in Bush's first term, and also as American presidents before him, whether they were Republicans or Democrats, engaged in democratic exceptionalism. That is, supported authoritarian regimes in the Middle East and the Muslim world and a lack of freedoms and human rights, believing that their national interest, that is the national interest of the West, particularly the United States that I'll be talking about tonight, but also others, required the stability of regimes. Of course, Bush then used the promotion of democracy as an excuse for the invasion and occupation of Iraq. But what did Muslim populations say then that they wanted? And later I'll say what Muslim populations say now. It's almost quite close to the same. I worked with the Gallup organization and its world polls of 35 Muslim countries. And what we discovered was that Muslim countries and their citizens, while they had problems with the United States and with the West, admired the US, for example, with regard to its education, its technology, its democracy, and its freedoms, but were concerned about the fact that it didn't seem to be that there was the concern to promote democracy in the Muslim world, but rather that you had this democratic exceptionalism. As I have noted, the US support for authoritarian regimes, security states, the mukhabarat, as they like to say in the Arab world, priorities not the promotion of democracy, but support for authoritarian regimes and Israeli colonization and occupation of Palestine. The US and the UK, in fact, used the promotion of democracy and human rights as a rationale for invading Afghanistan and Iraq and for the occupation of Iraq. When we take a look at the Arab Spring, and we look at Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Bahrain, and the movement of populations within them to overthrow their governments and to want to implement more direct governance, or if you will, democratization, it underscored the desire for democracy and the need in the West for a new foreign policy, But in a conference that I ran with a Turkish NGO in Istanbul right after the Arab Spring began, what we discovered, and there at the attendance there were members in the leadership of Ennahda, the Muslim Brotherhoods of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and other groups. We discovered that the concern of many was the deep state, and particularly among the Egyptians. And it should have been their concern, because what we see is that the deep state, that is security forces, the legal situation, the institutions of government, were all appointed by authoritarian regimes. And the concern was, as one of them said, that when you had your revolution in America or France, the winners won and the losers died or were put in prison or fled. But the deep state was still in place, even as Morsi was elected, for example, in Egypt. Would the US and the EU accept or support democratization, they asked, and the possible role for Islamic movements or Islamic political parties? Well, we saw what happened in Egypt. General Sisi and the military engaged in a coup. What were the responses of the US and the EU? Initially, they were kind of stunned and didn't know which way to go. And indeed, in the US, you could find in a single week, the President of the United States and the Secretary of State saying two different but complementary things. One would say, President Mubarak has been a longtime ally. The other would say, we respect the right of the people in the country to, their right to protest and to indicate what they would want. But at the end of the day, Obama did not call the Egyptian Sisi coup a coup. He, in effect, refused to call the coup a coup. As one prominent professor of international affairs said, but a coup is a coup is a coup. The US, the EU, and here particularly the UK and France, in fact, in a short term, returned to the conventional wisdom, and in the name of securitizing, making the state more secure, worked with and traded with the Sisi government, in effect, accepting its legitimacy. Gulf states, especially the UAE and Saudi Arabia, had bankrolled and participated in the planning and the coup in Egypt, and after it, bankrolled to the numbers of billions of dollars the Sisi government. The US and the EU remained silent. They accepted the legitimacy of the Sisi government in effect. Now, when we take a look at the Donald Trump administration and its policies with regard to Islam, Muslims in the Muslim world, we get a much more problematic image. Trump, as a candidate for president, in a big media interview on CNN, said Islam hates us. He didn't say some Muslim militants hate us. He didn't say some Muslim countries hate us. He said Islam hates us. And he was pressed on it by the interviewer. In fact, two interviewers within the same weekend. And his answer was, oh, well, there are lots of them. There are lots of them. You should figure out what it is. When we look at the foreign policies regarding to the Muslim world, we see that they were primarily concerned with the Middle East, concerned with support for Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for both MBS and MBZ, for its policies versus the response to Iran. We saw also President Trump almost immediately when he became president, within his first week, implementing what he called the Muslim ban. banning citizens from a number of Muslim countries, and in fact, at a certain point, and added a few non-Muslim countries because our Supreme Court had a problem with just focusing on Muslim countries. When we look at members of the Trump administration, we find that a number of them actually have been very closely associated with Islamophobia organizations and movements. That is, movements that are critical of Islam and Muslims are, in fact, in their speech, not only critical, but at times it's hate speech, and engage in actions that attempt to marginalize Muslims and, in fact, even to affect their institutions. So if we look at the President Trump's administration, Steve Bannon, one of the earliest members and advisors, Mr. Pompeo, who headed the CIA and was Secretary of State, and Stephen Miller. So if you take Pompeo, Pompeo was very closely associated with Act for America, which is probably the largest anti-Muslim movement in America. He attended their meetings, and when he became Secretary of State, he received their major award. When we look at foreign policies and alliances of the Trump administration, the emphasis was on security and business and military contracts. And he emphasized and bragged about, when he came home from Saudi Arabia on his first visit, the billions of dollars worth of contracts that he was bringing back, and we continue to get. And then the military contracts, but not concerned about authoritarianism or human rights. In fact, he emphasized in Saudi Arabia that what he shared in common with Saudi Arabia and with other countries was securitization of the countries and business and military contracts, but that it was the business of countries, what they did in their countries. It was not the business of the United States. By saying that, he was saying whatever they did, they were authoritarian, they didn't care about human rights, we weren't going to get involved. And in fact, he actually demonstrated that he preferred dealing with authoritarian regimes. China, North Korea, the Philippines, authoritarian regimes, as well as in the Middle East, two of the countries that he dealt with most were Saudi Arabia and the UAE. But let's take a look at the policy with regard to Israel and Palestine, for this was really an astonishing move and movement even more to the right, as it were. Trump was totally and uncritically supportive of the Netanyahu government and policies. He moved the capital to Jerusalem. He approved Israel's seizure of the Golan Heights, its illegal settler settlements, and the threat to complete control, that is Israel's threat to completely take control of the West Bank. His people brokered an accord with the UAE, and then with Egypt, Morocco, Sudan, and others, in what was seen as a movement to improve relations, with somehow a vague promise that things would become better in terms of Israeli policy. And we've seen that wasn't the case if we look at the latest problems between Hamas and Israel. Now let's look at President Biden and his Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. I have always admired Joe Biden as a decent, hardworking, principled, and compassionate politician in person. Despite that, he was not my first choice for president. And despite the fact that he wasn't my first choice for president, I did fully support him in our recent presidential election. I also want to note that Biden has not been in office for approximately 5 months, but not been in office for a year or 2 years. So what we have thus far is an incomplete snapshot, although I think there are problems. I admire and support many of his domestic policies. I think they're very, very important in terms of the balance of the relationship between rich and poor, in terms of dealing with issues of poverty, issues of race, issues of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, dealing with Black Lives Matter, but also the importance of our Native Americans. But when it comes to the Middle East, his track record is a matter of deep concern. Thus far, he and his Secretary of State have not been able to overcome the conventional approach and bias of US foreign policy in the Middle East with regard to Israel and its privileged place. Now, to get to the Biden policy, with regard to human rights, he's brought human rights back on the table. In contrast to Donald Trump, Biden and Blinken, his Secretary of State, have emphasized the return of human rights in US foreign policy. And so, for example, with regard to Saudi Arabia and Iran, but not with regard to authoritarian regimes like Egypt, the UAE, and Bahrain. So the Biden administration has said that Saudi Arabia is an ally, but that it's going to be concerned about human rights. It's important to keep that in mind because I'm going to indicate that he's contradicted himself on this. While indicating its support for the security of the Saudi government, it indicated its concern about the human rights record and backed away from supporting Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen. However, in March 2021, most recently, the Biden administration confirmed that Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, approved the assassination of the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. In fact, Biden followed through on a campaign promise to release a summary report by the US intelligence community of its findings on the murder, which Trump did not do. And he did do that. So this 2 years of stonewalling by Trump was overcome. But Biden failed to hold Khashoggi's killers accountable. What do I mean by that? Worried about disrupting the US-Saudi relationship, Biden decided not to impose sanctions on the Crown Prince. Somebody that our intelligence agency basically said approved and was behind the assassination. And remember, the body was dismembered, etc. Let me talk more specifically about Israel and Palestine. Sadly, both Biden and Blinken in their policy have a history of uncritical support for Netanyahu. Biden has been, and it's been shown on TV, in the old days when you had this very close relationship by certain governments, and he was the head of the Foreign Relations Committee, for example, of saying that in fact that he and Netanyahu were very, very close, that although he was not Jewish, he was a Zionist, that is referring to himself. Blinken is American, Jewish in background. Stepfather was a victim of the Holocaust, and has been a very strong, and from my point of view, uncritical supporter. And both of them have been with regard to Netanyahu and Israeli policies and actions in occupied Palestine. And little thus far indicates what they will do with the new Israeli leadership, which has been hardline, criticized Netanyahu, in fact, for agreeing to a ceasefire with Hamas. Now, contrary to the UN and major human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, for example, issued a 203-page report, and B'Tselem, an Israeli human rights organization, issued a report referring to Israeli apartheid and human rights violations, the devastation of bombing, and the destruction in Gaza, condemning them. But the US has opposed the International Criminal Court's decision to investigate Israel for war crimes. Biden and Blinken have accepted the Trump administration involvement and support for the movement of Israel's capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, basically saying, we don't agree with it. And in a sense, we don't agree with it. We might not have done it, but we're going to accept it. They have not questioned Israel's seizure of and declared sovereignty over the Golan Heights, expansion of illegal settler settlements in occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, and the threat to take complete control of the West Bank. Blinken has introduced US support for the Abraham Accord, which was an accord put together by the US and the UAE. with then partners, as I said earlier, of Egypt, Morocco, Sudan, and others. Blinken has indicated U.S. support for a two-state solution, but said not in the near future. This is outrageous. After decades and decades of the occupation of Palestine, to say not in the future. Why not? Blinken and Biden's statements sometimes are untrue. Blinken claimed that victims of Israeli war crimes can get justice from the governments responsible. Quote from Mr. Blinken, "I believe, whether it's the United States or Israel, that we both have the mechanisms to make sure there's accountability in any situations where there are concerns about use of force, human rights, etc. I believe that both of our democracies have that capacity." Blinken is too smart not to know the history, and that simply has been false in the past, and it's false today. There has not been any significant investigation of the U.S. and of Israel, especially with regard to Israeli apartheid. And also when Israel declared itself primarily, or Mr. Netanyahu declared it, primarily a Jewish state in which non-Jews, in effect, had secondary citizenship. And the fact that they have continued with illegal settlements. As the Israeli human rights group, B'Tselem, said, for Israeli attacks on Gaza over 12 years, quote, "Despite the horrifying lethal consequences of intentionally bombing civilian objectives, which constitutes a war crime, Israel has never been held accountable or forced to pay any price for implementing this policy. Therefore, where has the U.S. been? If in fact, as Mr. Blinken says, the U.S. is capable of it. And certainly you can't say Israel's capable of it because it's not going to examine itself." Blinken and his team talk about addressing sources of conflict, but always frame it as Israel defending itself from Hamas throughout the whole thing, no matter how disproportionate the killing of Palestinians was, no matter how much the bombing of civilians took place. Now, that does not deny that Hamas fired rockets. But the question is, why did they fire rockets? They don't talk about the fact that that confrontation, the cause for it was that Israeli police stormed the Al-Aqsa compound during Ramadan. And then again on Eid, one of the holiest days, they did it in terms of a totally disproportionate level. At the same time, they not only stormed the Al-Aqsa compound, but the Israelis attacked and destroyed and engaged in destroying many lives within Gaza in terms of the Palestinians. Israeli military attacks destroyed hundreds of buildings and key infrastructure and killed 256 Palestinians, including 66 children and 36 women. In Israel, at least 13 people were killed, including 2 children. Have Biden or the EU indicated a desire to deal with the causes, the drivers of the conflict? The answer is no. And here I quote a distinguished former ambassador of Egypt, and now, to Egypt and to Israel, who's now a professor at Princeton. Quote, "There's no question the administration would prefer to achieve stability and promote Gaza reconstruction over having to deal with the more problematic underlying drivers of the conflict. There is no evidence the administration wants to actively promote the two-state paradigm, although it has repeated that mantra." A major shift today in U.S. policy and the policy of some of its European allies, such as France and the UK, for example, is required. Biden should forge a new policy and relationship with all the players, Hamas, the PNA, and not its preferential treatment of Israel, a state that has become an apartheid state, a religious state in which Arab Christians and Muslims are second-class citizens. They need to recognize and deal with Hamas, which they did not do. Blinken went out of his way not to meet with Hamas, to talk to Hamas. Even when they talked about the funding that they're talking about, promising a considerable amount of money, it was to be given to the PNA as a possibility to distribute it to Hamas, which is an absolute insult. For those of you that don't remember the history, some 10 years ago when there was an election, the Hamas candidate won. And in fact, Israel and Western powers recognized instead Mahmoud Abbas of the PNA. They need to recognize and deal with Hamas. Hamas is simply not just a militant organization, by some called a resistance movement, by the US and a number of countries called a terrorist movement. It's not just a militant organization, but it is also a political party based in Gaza. Successful negotiations will entail some of the following. Not only support for the existence and security of the state of Israel, but also for the creation, security, and support for a Palestinian state. And doing that not next year or the year after or the year after that, but announcing that this is the project that the US will pursue. The end of Israel's apartheid policy and wall and its illegal settlement movement. And engage not just in praising the Israeli government, but criticism of illegitimate acts of violence and terror committed not only, but also and disproportionately by the Israelis, including a significant killing, and I gave the statistics before, of children and women. We need to transcend a policy of Israeli exceptionalism. No matter what Israel does, we don't criticize it. Privileging Israel's interests and thus failing to pursue an even-handed policy would have to be supplanted by a policy that held Israel to the same standards of other nations, to the same standards that they would hold Hamas to, or the PNA, insisting also on the compliance with UN Security Council resolutions and with international law. Now, let me end by talking about the West and its conventional framework, policies, and some changes. The challenge for American and European policymakers remains to replace that conventional framework that relies on heavily supporting authoritarian regimes, their military, their security forces, to ensure stability and security. It needs to move beyond their past and current policy that equates protection of Western national interests with the stability and security of these regimes. It's a policy that's driven more by fear of the unknown, and often that fear is particularly of Islamic movements and political parties. And we have seen in a number of countries that that doesn't hold up. The Muslim Brotherhood was democratically elected. Ennahda was democratically elected. That support for principles of self-determination, democracy, and human rights, which in fact, the US and Europe claim to stand for and support, that these hold true. Vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine, vis-a-vis authoritarian Muslim countries. Major polling by Gallup, as I said, and others show that a policy of uncritical support, while attractive to authoritarian allies and their entrenched elites, feeds anti-Americanism in particular, but also anti-European allies like the UK and France, and fears of Western intervention, invasion, occupation, and dependency. There's a need for a new narrative that is separate from the Cold War mentality and policy of democratic exceptionalism. And the results of the largest opinion poll of its kind in the Arab world was announced in October 2020. It was a poll of 30,000 respondents across 13 Arab countries with more than 300 researchers taking part. Two interesting statements. There is near unanimous support for democracy. 76% of the Arabs in these 13 Arab countries supported a democratic system. 74% of Arabs stated that a pluralist democratic system would be appropriate for their countries. The failure of the Arab Spring of major Western governments to support it has ushered in and reinforced entrenched regimes. Political grievances such as authoritarian, non-representative, and repressive governments, corruption, and economic stagnation should now be seen as US and EU targets for reform in terms of what they want to promote, in terms of what they provide to some countries by way of funding and contracts. The US and Europe should work with and use diplomacy, their political, economic, and military leverage to pressure Muslim authoritarian allies to broaden political participation, develop independent government institutions, a strong civil society that limit corruption and increase respect for human rights. Western governments must walk the way they talk. Western governments must provide substantial aid for economic and educational development, not for selling military hardware, which not only wreaks havoc in their own countries because often the hardware is used within the region and even against populations. They need to cut back substantially on arms sales and such high-profile symbols of oversized embassies, military bases, ships, and troops, all of which emphasize American and European armed presence and the tangible threat of dependency, intervention, and domination. If authoritarian Muslim governments and societies are to change through evolution, not revolution, rulers become more accountable to their people, and governments need to be more independent and pragmatic in their relations with the West. That will better reflect the interests, desires, and values of their population. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor John Esposito. Now we are going to invite the first of our two discussants. The first one will be Professor Dato' Muhammad Abu Bakar. Let me introduce you to all of you. Professor Muhammad Abu Bakar is a former head of the Department of International and Strategic Studies at the University of Malaya. He was the 12th holder of the Tun Abdul Razak Chair at the University of Ohio, United States. He has also been a visiting professor at the National University of La Plata, Argentina, a Fulbright visiting scholar at the University of Washington, USA, and a visiting fellow at University of Victoria, Wellington. And also a visiting fellow at the Center for Islamic Studies at Oxford. And beside that, he was a guest lecturer at the Cairo University in Egypt. He's now attached to the Institute for Islamic Civilization at University Sultan Zainal Abidin or UNIZA in Terengganu. And without further ado, I invite Professor Muhammad Abu Bakar to give his comments. The floor is yours, Professor Muhammad Abu Bakar.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Mr. Moderator, Professor Nazari, distinguished speaker, Professor John Esposito, and also my friend, fellow discussant, Professor Ahmed Fauzi. Well, first and foremost, I must thank Professor Esposito for zeroing on what he refers to democratic exceptionalism, and also the role of the deep state in the formulation of United States foreign policy. And he has well established the so-called inconsistencies in the practice of U.S. Foreign relation. I suppose that this kind of criticism is most timely, considering the change in the world political order, and also in relations to the growing multilateralism associated with current world politics. Well, granted that there has been this underside in U.S. Foreign policy for its overemphasis on what I would say domestic politics. After all, foreign policy is an extension of domestic politics. There is still a ray of hope in view of the need for various countries to uphold the tenets of democracy, which is growing now, and also in view of the fact that there have been renewed attempts at harmonization of interests between Muslim and the non-Muslim world. So the call made by Professor Esposito is, as I've noted earlier, is most timely for what he refers to a new approach to foreign policy in the context of the United States of America. In other words, a new narrative is needed to enable us to rejuvenate the democratic process, the democratization of the world. But of course, granted that they have had these problems, long-standing problems in U.S. foreign policy, vis-a-vis the Muslim world, whether those of authoritarian nature or democratic one, his call is a tall order. It's not going to be easy. It's easier said than done. That's number one. Why we appreciate the proposal made by Professor Esposito is going to be very difficult, for the simple reason that foreign policy is very much an extension of domestic politics. But at the same time, there is a ray of hope, given that now there is a change in the world political climates, to put it that way. The new configuration at the international level amounting to greater multilateralism. Let us compare notes. Earlier on, in the context of the Cold War, it would have been more logical for the US to practice this democratic exceptionalism for the simple reason that the circumstances of the time, of the Cold War time, conspired to produce the anti-communist drive, either in the West, in particular in the United States, or elsewhere beyond the United States. So in other words, the circumstances of the time have more or less railroaded many of these countries into this kind of campaign against communism. So whichever countries, authoritarian or not, will be treasured for their worth. In other words, Muslim countries, either authoritarian regimes, will be considered of great strategic value as far as the United States was concerned. So they were allies, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran then, and not to mention Turkey, which have been grouped as anti-communist countries in the Cold War era. So there were great crusaders at the times of the Cold War. Furthermore, those various countries concerned, they were very much on the receiving side. They reaped lots of benefits, lots of dividends in the forms of aids, supplies of weapons, and whatnot for their anti-communist stand. So in other words, those were the great days whereby the US were supported almost all around, even by the Muslim countries, for their needs of the US help and for their anti-communist crusade. So whether this geopolitical landscape has changed or not is another issue. And for us, for sure, the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union have more or less paved the way for a new approach. And this is where the US also has to adopt a new way when it comes to the Muslim countries. In other words, the earlier democratic exceptionalism has to be abandoned for good, in order that America is seen as practicing what it preaches. That is very crucial. That is number one. Of course, we do know that we have to speak with some reservation, for the simple reason that the US also is confronted with some of its enemies in the region, even without the communists, even without the Cold War, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. For sure, US is confronting Iran. US is also having problems with Syria. We do know that. So in other words, while taking into account some of all this, the US is less of a precarious situation that is faced now, meaning that it's not as formidable as it used to be when it came to confronting the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Furthermore, more and more of these Muslim countries are also befriending the US, not to mention the various Islamic groups, which are enamored of Western ideas of progress. And they were also clamoring for some kind of democratic reform. So in other words, the US also must send feelers to some of these countries through diplomatic means to enable them to somehow extricate themselves from the present stranglehold of poverty or what have you. So in other words, it is no longer a question of making Muslim countries what they call useful enemies, like what they used to do before. And secondly, even European countries themselves are mellowing it. They are no longer as confrontational as they used to be during the Cold War. They are trying to build bridges with many of these Muslim countries. So in other words, against this backdrop, the ray of hope that I have just spoken is necessarily a reality, for the simple reason that not only there is a change in this political landscape, but also for the fact that we are in a better position to harmonize relations, harmonization of interest between the Muslim world and the non-Muslim world, in particular the West. Of course, we still will take care of the tyrannical nature of some of these countries. In this regard, it would have been a gas for us to know that, as noted by Professor Esposito, that America is still practicing this kind of lopsidedness in its approach to some of these Muslim countries by supporting the Sisi government in Egypt, for example, and not recognizing the Hamas victory in Palestine, and so on. So in other words, this glaring inconsistency, as far as possible, has to be put to a stop so that America could advance its ideas and ideas pertaining to self-determination, pertaining to pluralism, as noted by Professor Esposito himself. And for this to happen, I suppose that the civil societies will have to play their role, as noted also by Professor Esposito. I go along with that. And for now, we have more and more civil society movement going into the mainstream of thought to create this context of situation, to enable the world at large, and America in particular, to somehow support these ideas of democratization, and at the same time to harmonize relations with the Muslim world. There's no longer a question of the fear factor of all, which somehow have bogged down some of the American foreign policy makers. So this context of situation has to be created even at home in the United States. And this is still happening, but it has not borne real fruits. So much so that it is impacting on the American foreign policy makers. There's no longer a question of having to doubt and describe the Muslims as barbaric and Islam as the religion of the sword, as the forces of darkness, and so on. We should stop this recycling of snapshots of the historic past, of the encounters between Muslims and non-Muslims. Those portrayal of Islam in negative terms, in stereotyping Islam as people from backward, people from almost another planet in this context. So in other words, we have to stop this propaganda by calling Muslims as the sworn enemies of the democratic globalists and the liberal capitalists. And furthermore, if at all we can homogenize this relationship along these democratic lines, I can say and I can assure you that more and more of this, not just Muslim countries, but Muslim societies will somehow patronize the United States. Of course, they may not go fully for the Western ideas of progress, but they might be in a better position to sever some of the ideas and ideas of the Western ideas of progress, which have emanated from the West for a long, long time, which is presently being shared by those others. So to sidetrack this, to put this in a frozen manner, as is being done somehow by some American foreign policy maker, is to do away with, I think Professor Esposito has spoken elsewhere, with the 1.6 billion Muslim all over the world. So in other words, the US policy maker for that reason, and in particular, and the European Union and the world as a whole must fill in the blanks, when it comes to charting out the foreign policies of those countries concerned. There is number one. I hope I've taken about 10 minutes. I will go and follow it up with another 5 minutes about the American home front, how the foreign policy posture and preference of the America can join with its own posture at the internal level, at domestic level. So in other words, if you talk about a home ground, we see that there is a need for the US also to concentrate on the people, on the subject of the United States, so that they will become part of the support system, which will somehow galvanize those various Americans in the support of the democratic process, in the advancements of American ideals, regardless of areas of countries of the world. I suppose that this is going to be congenial as well for the Muslims of America who are now growing in strength by the day. So in this regard, we know that the visibility of the Muslims in America has been cited all around, has become subjects of ridicules, and has caused concern, so much so that America as a whole has used that as a kind of an excuse to show that with exponential growth of Americans, Muslims, America also will be under siege. The way America had been so during the Second World War, when it tried to punish the Japanese simply because of the Pearl Harbor. At the same time, when it comes to the portrayal of Islam abroad, the US policymakers, the media, etc., must make sure that those disproportionate portrayal of Islamic radicalism, so to speak, of political Islam should also be placed to a stop, simply because the people in America have been overtly exposed to ISIS, Boko Haram, and the Taliban, so much that they are so much energized by the so-called extremism of the Muslim world, and that very much colors their perception, not just them, but also the policy makers who have never been privy and party to some of the secrets, or simply ignore the truth, as noted by Professor Esposito. So in that sense, I submit that there is a need for the United States to show greater understanding, abroad when it comes to its foreign policy preferences, to understand the need of their own Muslims. And for that, there should be a collective will of thought among them, within the government, to understand the sufferings of these Muslims, the asylum seekers, the migrants, the dispossessed, among the people of the United States, so that they, in no time, will not just imbibe the American culture, but also will be equally sympathetic to some of the roles abroad. But as for now, we do know that some have turned into a kind of a fertile ground for anti-Americanism at home whenever there is an upsurge of anti-Islamism abroad. So in other words, the two can work in tangent. So while abroad, America will be practicing a fair foreign policy, at home, you have people who will be impacting all around as a result of this so-called even-handedness in American foreign policy. So those ideas of Muslim radicalism, Muslim extremism will no longer enter into the so-called clash of images. On the one hand, we do know that the Muslims have been going around telling the world Islam is a religion of peace. But at the same time, for the American, in particular, the American decision makers, they have been going around parroting some of the earlier tenets, the old mantra, Islam as the religion of the sword. So in other words, this clash of images have dominated the scene for a long, long time. After all, some of these people were really unrepresentative of the Muslims as a whole, considering the 1.6 billion as noted by almost all of us when it comes to understanding the magnitude of the Muslim people. So in other words, there should be this appreciation of the problem to enable us to create these people into worthy citizens, responsible people in the making of the American dream a reality. Well, earlier on, they have had difficulty, of course, in embracing the Jews, embracing the Irish, following the Irish debacle in the 19th century. And after a long while, they were able to stomach their presence, and they were able to accept them as part of them into their fold. And finally, the Irish, the Jews, the Polish, etc., were part of the American makeup. So inshallah, we do hope that these various Muslims, being responsible citizens, being people who are equally accountable for what they do, will be absorbed into the mainstream of American life. And if foreign policy is an extension of domestic politics, that very presence of Muslim also will necessarily have a bearing on American foreign policy. Islam and the Muslim will no longer be seen as the outsiders, people outside the mainstream of civilization. So I hope in a nutshell, my reactions to Professor Esposito will somehow complement some of his findings. I must say that he has been very open when it comes to describing those various regimes in the Middle East, and also about the discrepancy, the glaring discrepancy between what America preaches and what America practices when it comes to the Middle East, including that of Israel and Palestine. So thank you, Professor Esposito, for the exposure. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Muhammad Abu Bakar. Now it's actually more than 1 hour past Professor Esposito's bedtime. So I hope he goes to bed at 9. So it's already past 10 p.m. over there in the States. I hope he took a cup of coffee before we start the program. Anyway, we are now going to listen to comments by our person, Professor Ahmad Fauzi Abu Hamid, and I will introduce him to all of you. Professor Fauzi is a professor of political science at the School of Distance Education in University of Science Malaysia in Penang, Malaysia. He's also a visiting professor at the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at University of Malaysia, Sarawak. He has held visiting fellowships with the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at the NTU in Singapore and at the SEAS Yusof Ishak Institute, also in Singapore. And also at the Southeast Asia Regional Center for Counter-Terrorism of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Malaysia. He was recently the scholar in residence at Oxford Center for Islamic Studies in Oxford. And basically, he is trained as a political scientist. He was trained as a political scientist at universities of Oxford, Leeds, and Newcastle, UK. And his research interests lie within the field of political Islam in Southeast Asia. Without further ado, I invite Professor Fauzi to give his comments. Go ahead, Professor Fauzi.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Nazari, for the introduction. Okay, and my fellow panelists, Professor Muhammad Abu Bakar, respected speaker, Professor John Esposito, okay, whom we all political scientists who specialize in political Islam read. All of us read Esposito's writings, and my respected colleagues, okay, among fellow academics in the audience. Okay, thanks, Professor Esposito, for the very enlightening talk. Okay, and I don't have much to argue with that. Perhaps along the same lines with Professor Muhammad Abu Bakar, most of the things I would say here is rather complementary. And I would outline here two major stumbling blocks, okay, of against the West and the Muslim world converging or coming together. Normally, when we get these types of titles, navigating the way forward, so we academics like to speak in ideal terms, all the good things, coming together, peace and prosperity and so on. Okay, rather than speaking to the reality on the ground, okay, which is much more difficult and troublesome. As firstly, the question of human rights. As Professor Esposito has rightly pointed out, there is much hypocrisy in terms of exceptionalism. Okay, Israeli exceptionalism in Palestine and Israel. And I'd like to link this with Dr. Mahathir's statement just recently given in September 2019, okay, in New York, in the United Nations, when he reiterated his past statement that the roots of terrorism in the Muslim world lies in the Palestine-Israel issue. Okay, the fact that Israel, okay, is the origin of the modern terrorism, and the creation of the Israeli state itself was based on terrorism. Now, people like Menahem Begin, Moshe Dayan, Yitzhak Rabin, these people were involved, I think, in the terrorist groups like Irgun and Stern Gang, who terrorized the Palestinian population, okay, after the Second World War. If I'm incorrect, please correct me. So there is this view in the Muslim world of grave, serious hypocrisy, okay, on the part of the West. And if I can quote here, President Biden just recently said, with respect to his meeting with Putin, okay, the Russian president, what did he say? So human rights is going to always be on the table. I told him meaning Putin. It's not about just going after Russia when they violate human rights. It's about who we are, who meaning the Americans. Okay, how could I be the president of the USA and not speak out against the violation of human rights? Okay, etc., etc. Okay, but then what the Muslim world sees is a double standards, okay, in terms of giving the human rights to the Israelis and human rights to the Palestinians. Okay, and mind you that the victims in this Palestinian-Israeli issue are not just the Arabs, not just the Muslims. Okay, so it's not a question of merely the question of the West versus the Muslim world, because among the victims of the Israeli-Palestinian issue are Palestinian Christians. Do we forget the massacre of Elabun? Okay, way back in 1948, you can just Google the Sons of Elabun. which is a documentary produced in 2007. Palestinian Christians were massacred, villages were razed to the ground. Okay, and I mean empathize, okay, with the Middle Eastern Christians, on whom I've written a chapter on in the Oxford Handbook of Christianity on Asia. You look at there, and my chapter there is on the Middle Eastern Christians. Of course, the Muslims have many grave complaints. Okay, do we forget the Yasin massacre of 1948? Have there been any apologies for that? And do we forget the Sabra Shatila in 1982? Okay, which happened when I was a kid. I was in secondary school then, and there was never any apology, okay, or even an urge for Israel to apologize, okay, over this gross violations of human rights. So, is there a way forward? Okay, really, is there a way forward if there is this consistent attitude, okay, of putting some people more equal, okay, than others, of putting the human rights of the Israelis, okay, higher, okay, on a higher pedestal than the human rights of the Arabs, okay, whether they are Muslims or Christians. And then the second stumbling block, I would say, and this has not been touched, I think, by Professor Esposito and also Prof. Muhammad Abu Bakar, it can be summarized in two words. Firstly, eschatology, and secondly, millenarism. And I think these two driving forces, okay, will be a major obstacle, because many religious Muslims, Jews, and Christians actually do subscribe to them on the coming of an Armageddon, or in Arabic, Al-Malhamah Kubra. Okay, and a lot of this hadith or sayings of the Prophet, peace be upon him, are being related to Muslims with the occurrences or happenings that we are seeing all around us, even COVID-19, okay, even the vaccine, okay, even whether the vaccine is part of the stamp of the beast and so on. It's all over the internet, okay, regardless of whether it's conspiracy theory or not. But it's driving even foreign policy, I would say. Now, in fact, people like, especially the Republican presidents, say in the United States, Reagan had a spiritual advisor, right? Trump, he also had a spiritual advisor who would advise him on things. Okay, although the advisor was mocked at when some of his predictions, some of her predictions actually didn't come true, okay, after the elections. But believe it or not, there are, I think, many people who do subscribe to these theories, and it's not something, okay, which is that unusual. I think in the Islamic tradition we have Kitab al-Fitan, okay, by Nuaim ibn Hamad, and we also have Al-Bidayah wa Nihayah, okay, by Ibn Kathir, which outlines this. And when you look at the exegesis or interpretations of some of these traditions by Muslim scholars, most would say that what is meant by the Prophet as the Romans in the Hadith now would be the West, and the West will be the group led by especially the USA and the UK. And the problem is magnified when some people are not contented with becoming readers or subscribers to these to these tenets, but they want to become players. So you get people like ISIS. Now, ISIS is eschatological. Okay, if we look at some of its pronouncements, okay, in fact, the magazine Dabiq, was actually named after the town in Syria in which the final battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil, okay, would allegedly take place. Okay, and if you look, as Prof. Esposito was mentioning also about the troubles in Al-Aqsa, okay, is it not guided, okay, by the actions of religious Jews or ultra-religious Jews who believe in the taking over of Masjid Al-Aqsa based on their belief, okay, in the impending arrival of Messiah. Okay, so these, I mean, religious traditions, okay, however very, I mean, verifiable you think of them or not, are actually, I would say, driving policies in the Middle East and even driving international relations. And you have a few figures in the Muslim world. Okay, if you refer to Malaysia, for instance, okay, you have the former leader of Darul Arqam, Ash'ari Muhammad. Okay, and in fact, with this movement for quite some time in the 1990s was based on some eschatological doctrines, which were clearly written in his book. And now today you have Sheikh Imran Hussein, who also has a large following among Malaysians. Okay, although some of his views are controversial, for instance, his renunciation of the Ottoman Empire, okay, regarding it as not a legitimate Islamic empire, as many other ulama have said so. And he also, I think, he also criticizes the conversion of the Hagia Sophia, okay, back into a mosque. Okay, so despite these differences of opinion, what I'm trying to say here is that these are important factors, okay, which need to be taken into account when we consider international relations, okay, especially for countries which have religion, okay, as part of the consideration of foreign policy. And in the case of Israel, okay, and I think Naftali Bennett is more religious than even Benjamin Netanyahu. Okay, this will continue to be something very important and perhaps an obstacle towards the coming together, okay, of the Abrahamic of the faiths, the Abrahamic faith in the near the end of time. Okay, and with that, I'll end my brief intervention and give the floor back to Prof. Nazari.
Thank you very much, Professor Mawfazi. Very sweet and short and very, I think, very interesting comments from you as well. We have a couple of questions, quite a number of questions here. Actually, I want to ask Professor Esposito whether you want to address the points raised by our discussants, or you want me to go straight to the questions.
Yeah, I'll address the points briefly. I begin a little autobiographically and say that when I received my PhD in 1974, I remember thinking that at a certain point, I really felt sorry for those, I won't use the words that I use because they're a little off color, those poor professors who spent their whole career dealing with Palestine and Israel. To me, they were like scientists working on a cure for cancer, and they spent their whole career in their life and there was nothing. I knew surely in my time that wasn't going to be the case. And I happened to share that with a friend of mine who was on the National Security Council with President Carter and around my age. And he had the same belief, and so when it comes to how optimistic am I, the fact is the forces of, first of all, the forces of globalization and the way we're pursuing globalization, the forces of power, military and political power, the rise of China, the rise economically of China and India, etc., and the fact that Russia can't believe that it's no longer the Soviet Union, the love of power that we saw during the Trump administration and with many of his followers, and then the negative thing that took place, on January 6th when they stormed, the Capitol. the rise of white nationalism and supremacism, which dovetails with what my colleague was talking about earlier, just now, the force of religion. I teach a course on religion and violence almost every semester, and it runs across all the religions. You know, I mean, I've been trained in 4 different religions in my own background. And so people, when we would look at Hinduism or Buddhism, you'd always look at a certain set of texts, you know, and Christians would look at the Bible and Jews, but they wouldn't deal with, we would deal with the transformative text. But how about the stories of occupation in the Old Testament? How about the stories of the equivalent of genocide? You know, but doing it in the name of God. I'm not all that. I mean, I'm not super optimistic. I hope to see a movement forward. If you, from my talk, you can definitely see that I'm not. I worry about when it comes to the Middle East, Biden and Blinken, particularly with Palestine and Israel. I don't see them capable of really moving in the direction that they can. And I'm worried that Arabs and other Muslims are walking away from Palestine, either by not saying anything or by this Abraham Accord. And, you know, the idea of the UAE entering into an accord, I'm sorry, with Israel, and what were the expectations? And the idea that America used its pressure to get Morocco and Sudan and, you know, and try to pull others in. This doesn't fare very well. I mean, if I were a Palestinian, you know, so I don't at all. I can remember a number of years ago in San Francisco, my wife and I got into a taxi cab. This was quite a few years ago. And I could tell the cab driver was a Muslim. He had certain things in the front, but I didn't want to, and I thought he might be a Palestinian, but I didn't know how to raise things. But somehow we got around to it. And he said to me, he said, who do I worry about? He said, I worry about the Arabs. He said, you know, they talk good about the Palestinians, but at the end of the day, how much do they really do? You know? So I worry about that. And I think that that's really an issue. And I think that it is important for us to realize that simultaneously what you see going on, for example, in the West, is a movement towards and concern about a lot of people walking away from religion and the dominance of what some would see as kind of secular unbelief. But at the same time, there is in fact a rise of religious fervor. And while there's a positive side to it, there's an awful lot of these negative groups that are, at the end of the day, the millenarian types, you know, et cetera. It's a real issue. To be autobiographical, my wife and I built a house here in Florida. And it was our escape house. We called it the Great Escape. And then I realized what the Great Escape really means to some people. And I thought, we can't touch that anymore. So we have to call it our cottage or something like that. So I'm very realistic. And I think it becomes really important for the next generation of leaders, but also educators to really think about how do we move and educate for thinking about the world in a different way. And I would end with this, with regard to my comments here. And that is that I was a very strong supporter of Bernie in terms of, and the reason is, if you look at Bernie and the progressives, when they talk about inequity in society, when they talk about medical care for all, when they talk about security, or when they talk about Palestine and Israel, you know, they make sense. One of the positive things that we do see is that there is a movement among many progressives who are of multiple faiths, including many in the younger Jewish population, and others who are older but who've become totally disaffected with Mr. Netanyahu has done, in which he has taken a country that used to have a considerable liberals and then hawks. And in fact, if you look at the stats, it goes the other way. So that the new folks that were elected could criticize Netanyahu for somehow appeasing Hamas and coming to this accord. You know, I take the, you know, the statements of my colleagues very seriously, and I think everyone should. I think, you know, for those who are younger, for those that have children, you know, they should not simply get drawn into just worrying about getting ahead, as it were, but worry about where they're getting ahead in, what kind of world it is, not just in their own country, but let alone in the world. I mean, we don't know where the next conflagration can take place. We certainly know that it can occur. I mean, I think that I have no doubt about that. And I am certainly, when you look at Palestine and Israel, there is nowhere near the kind of commitment and muscle that one would need to even begin to do anything. Significant change is going to have to take place within Israeli politics, let alone American influence in Israelis. So now I'm happy to go to the questions that others may have.
Thank you very much, Esposito. Just a quick comment about what you mentioned about what's happening in the U.S. I studied in the U.S. in mid-1980s, and at that time nobody was speaking about Palestine. But so the situation now is very, very different, as you know, right? There are people now in Congress who are speaking very, very vocally. So I think I have more hope for things to put pressure on Israel from America, and things to change because of the pressure from inside America rather than from the Muslim world, because we see what's happening in Saudi and some Arab countries. They are getting worse and worse. So probably the hope is more towards American changes in America as far as changes in the Muslim or Palestine specifically. And anyway, now it's for me to go to the questions. It's written in the chat, so I'll go according to who comes first. So the first one is a fairly long question from Professor Said Munira. She said, "Mine is a theoretical question. Over the last 20 years or so, there have been developments within the discipline of international relations which are relooking at traditional theoretical approaches. This would impact perceptions of power, hierarchy, alliances, diplomacy, and peace, etc. This also involves looking at non-Western epistemology, as well as incorporating methodologies from disciplines such as sociology, anthropology, and history. How can these alternative approaches to teaching and discussing in international relations or political science help in finding a solution to the issue of dominance or hegemony of the West on world order?" Fairly long question. So you
Yeah,
go ahead.
Easy answer is only God knows. But I think that, first of all, one of the things that was a problem in international relations in general was that it never took serious religion and the role of religion as in any way a positive or constructive. It never took a look at it. And that's been a problem in terms of then the way in which we see the world. Many people who were educated in the past, and certainly a lot of terrorism experts, et cetera, they immediately seize upon religion as the core problem, when in fact religion has been used within political, economic, and social context. If you take the teachings of Jesus, it changes with regard to politics when you get Christendom. You know, when in the 3rd or 4th century, suddenly Christianity becomes part of empire. I think that where these multidisciplines can make a difference is that, for example, in the course that I teach on religion and violence, when we then study, we look at history, we look, yes, at the role of religion, but we look at what was going on in that area politically. We look at, in a sense, the writings of anthropologists about what was going on, you know, in that society. I think all of those things need to come into play, but we're at a very early stage. And so as the questioner knows, because it's clear that she knows methodology and literature, the differences among scholars are still very, very considerable in terms of how they approach the positive or negative role of religion, how they even look at societies. Just one example. I remember a colleague of mine who was, we were talking about this, and he was a social scientist, and was saying that a number of his colleagues, they would be dismissive, not just of religion, but they would simply look and say that it makes no sense for people to be asked to pay the zakat in societies where you have a lot of poor people. Or why do people waste their money to travel and go on Hajj? You know, they almost all the money that they have. But the opposite approach was taken by somebody, but on the wrong track, in which he tried to argue in a positive way. Rather than arguing in a positive way about the role of religion and what you choose to make important in your life, what you define as the important thing, it was almost trying to say that you could show that there could be some sort of economic justification, which means, you know, what's your bottom line? And I think that that part of what, when we deal with studying other cultures, is to what extent can we appreciate the culture as well as the religion of other people. Just as, for example, when I studied Islam, I was very lucky. My teacher was a Palestinian and almost everybody in class was a Muslim. He got scholarships for everybody to come. Ismail al-Faruqi was the person. And it made a world of difference for me to see and deal with people that I came to know as being very intelligent, and then dealing with the way in which they configured what was important to them in terms of, and understood their religion, but also what was important in terms of life. I mean, you know, weighing the question of how important is it to be part of a superpower? You know, I mean, there are advantages, but what are the disadvantages? What does that do to a society? You know, I think it's, and I remember, this is not a good example to bring up, but I remember speaking actually in Penang at a big conference, and somebody got up and said, I was talking about Islam and modernization, and somebody got up and said, the problem we have, and there were all these signs, you know, that it was as if the US was responsible for violence, drug, you have, you know, pictures of Western movies. He said, and the problem is your music, you know? And so I said, you have a problem. I said, I'm here with a colleague who's a specialist on Southeast Asia, an American. And one of the reasons he's glad to be here is that his daughter loves pop music and he can get all the illegal versions of it here on your campus. I said, if you walk on the campus, you can hear your students are playing this music and it's being produced. I think that, you know, part of what we really need to do, as I see it, if you look at history, the way I think a lot of us grew up, and most of us grew up, we look at history in terms of the past and then our present. The fact is, when you get to a certain point in your life, you realize, oh my God, this can go in a completely other direction, not just negatively, but positively, potentially, so that people will move to a different set of ideas on what human life means and what's important in terms of, you know, of life. I wish I could do better, but that's it for that.
Thank you. It's okay. Now, the second question is from Professor Jamal, is about, he asked whether you consider democratic exceptionalism in the major countries in the West Asia, or i.e. the Middle East, help shape US foreign policies towards the region, particularly with respect to the issues facing the Palestinians. I think you addressed this question already in your talk, right? So
Yeah.
I'll go to the next question by Professor Simon Wood. On China. China is now a big focus of America's attention. It also does business in the Middle East and shows a lot more respect for that region than does America. How might China influence the way America and the West deal with the Muslim world going forward?
That is a difficult question. I have been very interested in China and visited a number of times and received a fairly distinguished award. And so know a number of colleagues who work on this area. I think a real question is, what China, what government in China, in terms of dealing with this issue? But by that, I mean, I don't necessarily see the priorities of the Chinese government being one of, at least thus far, being concerned about dealing with the Palestine-Israel situation. You know, I think the government comes at it from a very different position. And I think it may be affected negatively if we look at what is happening with regard to the Uyghurs and other Muslims in China today. You know, if you can't deal with Muslims and Muslim identity in your own country, how are you going to deal when you're going to be dealing with Palestine and Israel? I don't think it's a priority for the Chinese. I don't even think it's an economic priority. I could be wrong, but I don't see it as an economic priority. And I don't have any sense that the Israelis are all that interested. It's very hard right now to see what countries are going to step forward in very significant ways. That is governments with regard to Palestine and Israel, with regard to the Palestinian issue. I think peoples, yes, depending on where and what country. I think there is a significant change in movement in America. You saw it with the Muslim ban and how you had Black Lives Matter and many other movements coming together. And those movements are now continuing to work together. NGOs working across, if you will, you know, their normal venues and really working together. I think that's happening, but I don't see any significant government. I mean, given the statements that I just read, for example, from the US, if you looked at British policy or French policy, I don't see that at all. And if anything, if you look at the last 6 months in France and Austria and Germany, you have two countries that have become more, in some ways, their policies more anti-Muslim in terms of the way they're treating their Muslim populations in civil society. So, you know, it's, I'm not very optimistic right now.
Yeah, you are not optimistic that from the West, from Europe, because of their attitude. But well, we saw positive changes in the US, and that could be a basis for optimism because among the younger generation, right?
Definitely.
The other thing, the other thing I want to maybe I just my own question is that there are crises going on in the West, in Europe, especially in terms of economic crisis. You have debt crisis problem. You have the gap between the rich and the poor, which is getting worse and worse, and therefore which is contributing to a lot of internal crisis in Europe. So and from what I can see, based on the trend, that there will be more internal problems. Yes, you know, Brexit shows that Europe is having a problem, and there may be more in the future. There may be disintegration rather than integration.
Yes.
So all these trend towards economic problems and therefore social upheavals. What are these? What are the implications of these developments of social upheavals and economic crisis in the West, in Europe, and in America, in terms of their relations with the Muslim world, you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously there'll be relations will be based upon and continue to be based on really self-interest, you know, not on human rights primarily, but I mean, human rights will come in, but that can change with governments, you know, with specific governments. But, you know, if you really look and you realize that the movement to the right, the movement to an anti-immigrant attitude and policy, the fact that I've done a lot of work on Islamophobia and gone to conferences, you know, in Europe, et cetera. And so you have somebody from Poland getting up and saying, the good news is we don't have many Muslims. The bad news is we have strong Islamophobia. Somebody from Australia gets up and says the same thing. So we've got these divisions in society And it's not just with regard to Muslims, it's with regard to ethnic groups, etc. And they're getting worse. And within some of these societies, as was said earlier, religion is becoming a factor. And you certainly see that, for example, during the Trump administration, and it can continue. It's still a major force. That is this kind of very right-wing form of Christianity, often dovetailing with a kind of sense of white supremacy, and in Europe, you see even progressive European countries that I really like and admire and like to go to, Northern Europe, Sweden and Norway, where you don't have that many Muslims, but suddenly you see the rise of these political parties. If anybody is who's listening, just goes to bridge.georgetown.edu. We have studies on all of the different movements in different countries. And I've been astonished at some of these countries. You have 2 and 3, political parties that are problematic. I mean, they're mushrooming all over the place. So again, we are so divided in America. This is an America that most of us grew up with, and it's still unpredictable. We live in an America where, when it comes to violence, it's out of control at times. We live in an America where we're not sure whether or not Trump could actually come back and get reelected. And if you look at, the situation with regard to Islamophobia in America and the UK, et cetera, it's become normalized. A major study done in 2015, came out in 2016, found that if you looked at Europe and America in terms of media, and particularly if you look, for example, at the US, UK, and Germany, 8 to 9 out of 10 stories were negative, were about extremism, were about, this is a real challenge. And who's going to lead now? Most of the countries that want to lead or be, emerge as leaders, whether it's Russia or India or, this isn't their concern at all, and I think that's a concern. A Buddhist country like Myanmar, when you think of Buddhism more as in generally in terms of the Buddha, the meditation and spirituality, and you've got militant Buddhist monks, responsible for whipping up the crowds in Rohingya. You look at India and the issues with regard to Muslims, recently, it would have been unthinkable. So I think it's funny. You're all depressing me tonight. I shouldn't have given this talk. I'm going to be able to sleep tonight.
Okay. All right. It's getting quite late now. Coming up to 11 o'clock, which is 2 hours past your bedtime. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the last question, and then after that, I'm going to invite our 2 discussers to give brief remarks, because they may want to respond to some of the issues raised. Right. So I will ask after I give the last question, which you will just bear in mind. You don't have to answer that yet. And then you just take the question and give your concluding remarks at the end. But I will read it anyway here. And then after that, I will invite Professor Fauzi and Professor Mark Walker to give some brief concluding remarks. And then I will pass it on to John Esposito for the last concluding remarks. So the question is from Dina Saman. Many foreign governments and international NGOs employ soft power in countries in Southeast Asia as donor, supporter of reform, etc. CSOs and think tanks are dependent on this support to do their work, to do the work that they do. Of course, there are challenges and ethical issues to consider. But when your government does not want to invest in research and local GLCs have their own ideas of CSR, what can we do? So this is feeling guilty because some of the, I think, think tanks and NGOs are maybe pro-West because they get money from the West. So how do they reconcile? Okay, that is for you to address at the end, plus your own concluding remarks. But before that, maybe I want to invite Professor Fauzi and Professor first, and then followed by Professor Bakar to give some brief remarks. So Professor Fauzi, you want to say something?
Okay, thank you, Prof. Nazari. Okay, and also to Prof. Esposito for the elaborations. okay, in answering the questions posed to you. And of course, I wouldn't like to end on a purely pessimistic note, okay, as I was saying just now. But I think the reality of the situation, I think, is much more difficult, okay, than we all and than we usually hope for. Okay, and in fact, in USM we have a peace studies unit, which I think from the moment that it was established until now, the situation in the world has become much less peaceful, okay, than okay, than from when it was established. And I was saying just now that some things, okay, in the scripture, okay, I wouldn't say that it's directly because of the literal meaning, okay, but rather how humans interpret it in an antagonistic manner. Okay, okay. I'll give an example. An oft-quoted verse in the Quran is Al-Baqarah 120. Walan tarda ankal yahudu walan nasara hatta tattabi'a millatahum. Okay, and you go everywhere when the question of the possible convergence between Islam and the West is discussed. You know, some preacher out there will come up with this verse, okay, which basically says that the Jews and the Christians, the in Nasara, will not have reba, will not accept you. Okay, and it's usually interpreted and explained and preach, okay, very vigorously, okay, in a manner where there is no point of or no hope of convergence at all. Okay, so I think it's much the work of social scientists like us, political scientists like us, and also religious scholars, okay, of in terms of in scriptural exegesis and I mean so on. So much to the extent that in India, okay, I think recently one so-called scholar, he allegedly removed some of the verses, some of the jihad verses in the Quran from the scripture. But of course, as Muslim believers, we can't do that. And how then do we reconcile then for some, some verses, okay, in the Talmud, for instance, okay, which doesn't give equal human rights to the Jews and the Gentiles. Okay, and so I don't know. For me, there's no ready-made answer for this, but it's a question of also intersection in research, okay, between politics and religion. And I think for those of us specializing in political religion or political Islam, okay, the joint research of these two disciplines are going to be very much important in the years to come. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Fauzi and Professor Mark Walker. Brief remarks from you. You need to unmute. Yeah.
Yes. How the West should go about resetting its relationship with the Muslim world? That is the key issue, and that is the crux of the problem raised by Professor Esposito. So that by resetting the relationship, we are going to end up with a win-win situation. There will be more convergence of interest between all sides, rather than we go about looking at the headlines only. So for the Muslims who have been energized by this, especially those in America, they too, while appreciating and be magnanimous when it comes to understanding the positions of the Muslim elsewhere, should be equally magnanimous when it comes to having to embrace the new life by making Islam a reality, in reality, not just in name, so that Islam is being translated through the medium of their actions, which surely will entice the rest others. That is number one. Let me go back a bit to the question raised by Dr. Munira Latas. And can I just continue from where Professor Esposito has left when it comes to answering the question? of course, for a long while, many policymakers and decision makers have been under the spell of the academics and the scholars. So at the same time, we do know that if at all on the ground, the real politics shows the way, meaning that there are other issues at hand, not just those history theories and of sociology and whatnot. So at the end of the day, probably the academics and the scholars will also jump on the bandwagon. They have to reset their mind also. So meaning that if for now, many of them are blinded to all this, have been barricading themselves behind the walls of old theories pertaining to history, sociology, and politics, then if at the end of the day, there is a huge change, a sea change in the development of international politics, like you don't know, they have to reset their mind, have a new way of approaching things in world politics. So we hope that this will happen. So the kind of concern shown by Dr. Monira Al-Attas will be overcome in no time, inshallah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Makbaka. Now I invite Professor John Exposito to give his concluding remarks.
Yes, I'll be very brief. First of all, I think that the issue of passages, talking about passages from the Quran, or the Old Testament or wherever, is the way I deal with it when it comes to the Quran is I basically say, let's look at multiple passages that deal with Jews and Christians. And if you look at the multiple, then you then raise a question. Well, wait a minute, if there's this constructive side, and you can build that with all the passages, then when you've got this other passage, then you've got to say, maybe we have to look at what was the context in which that occurred. And I think that hasn't been done enough with regard to all scriptures. It's just very easy for us to want to quote, what's convenient. I think that where I do see a positive side, I mean, I wouldn't be exhilarated by what I do in traveling around the world as much as I do, is that I do see among the new generations that coming along and different ways of studying and understanding, so that there is much more of an interest in understanding other cultures, other countries, and also bringing to bear, not just looking at it in terms of, okay, so I do security studies and somehow I don't really have to take time to really understand the religion and the culture. I can do it, just with this one slice. I see younger generations that certainly with regard to the progressive movement in the US, but also in other parts of the world. When I look at polling, for example, when we do polling, whether it's Gallup or Pew, et cetera, it's the younger generations that often are the least biased and prejudiced and more open, because one of the reasons is, when I give the example in the US, okay, when I was growing up and other people were growing up, you could be in an ethnic neighborhood that was completely Italian and Catholic, and you went to those schools and your education. Today, the more integrated where you are in society, when your parents, whatever they are like, when they send you to school, most of the schools they're going to go to, their kids are going to be interacting with people of color, of different religions, and so when Gallup has done its work, and also some other organizations, they find that it's the younger generation that's more open and less prejudiced, that often you have a higher percentage among the older generation. And I think that also has something to do with the way people will wind up thinking in at least a segment of the new generation. I mean, I'm amazed at some of the students that I've had. And I'll end with this. The idea that I can have first-year students in college come in, and at least 4 of them have already studied 3 languages. 3 out of 4 who are not Chinese are fluent in Chinese. And another one is fluent also in Arabic. Now, this is a small percentage, but it's significant. When I first went to Georgetown for the master's program, most of the students, almost all of them, had to start with Arabic from the very beginning. Now you find students who come and they've had, they've had their introduction to Arabic before they even come. I mean, I'm positive in terms of a segment of the younger scholars that I've worked with over the years on books and projects, et cetera. But what I worry about are the governments and to what extent they will be able to influence those governments, because we can naively say, well, some of these governments have elections. Well, it all depends on how the elections are conducted. You know what I mean? In terms of how it turns out. But I want to thank you very much for this evening. I can't believe I've been absolutely wide awake, and I probably won't be able to sleep for the next hour or two as a result of this. But I very much enjoyed it, and I very much enjoyed the kinds of give and take, and it makes it that much more enjoyable. So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Professor John Esposito. You actually ended everything on a positive note, talking about the young generation. Of course, whether they can influence the government or not in the future, that's another matter. But we want to be optimistic to say that yes, inshallah, they can influence the government in the future. So thank you again, and on behalf of the Academy, Professor Malaysia, and also thank you to our two discussants and those and members of the audience who participated in our discussion tonight. So I now hand over the microphone to Zaharul, the MC for tonight.
Thank you, Prof. Nazari, for moderating the webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now come to the end of the ceremony. It is hoped that the lecture and discussions that we had will benefit all of us. On behalf of Secretariat of APM, I would like to thank everyone for the support and cooperation given, without which this webinar could never be realized. Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Zaro, why not take a group picture?
Okay, that's a good idea to take a group picture, but everybody has got to switch on their video. All right. Please. Okay, Zaro. Yeah, Zaro, can you just count and then say whether you have already taken a picture? Yeah, microphone, please.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Wonderful.
1, 2, 3.
All right.
All right. Okay. All right then.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank you very
you.
much.
Bye-bye.
Salam from Nazari.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, everyone.
Good night. Good night to Esposito and everybody. Good session. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay, Prof. Bye. Assalamualaikum.
Assalamualaikum.